tonight we're talking about America's role in helping refugees at home and abroad. And all of us look at the terrible humanitarian aspects of what's going on around us, and we all recognize as well the enormous pressures of migration which are being placed upon not just a country like Jordan, but all of Europe as well, and to a certain extent the United States. And these are challenges to the order in those countries, as well as their well-being and wealth. And it joins or parallels the enormous humanitarian challenge of the time. And it makes everybody reflect upon causes of such things. Just what are the circumstances indeed which breed either the conditions or the conflict areas which create these enormous problems. So certainly this is on the mind of people who are serious almost always. It's been a major problem for decades. It's probably an eternal problem. But it's one that the headlines are surrounding today. And our government, as all of you know, has committed to recommending further support to help with the refugee problem. We're extraordinarily fortunate at this particular time to be joined by an authoritative voice, that of the Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration. The whole problem is there. And clearly in her reflections, both now and earlier in her career, she's been in contact with thousands of experts dealing with every facet of the problem. The Assistant Secretary is a graduate of Georgetown University, Foreign Affairs, University of Chicago, Public Policy Master's degree. Her early time in government was with the Office of Management and Budget, and where she was for I think at least 4 years, interrupted only by going as a researcher to the Bosch Foundation in Germany, which is a fascinating foundation in itself, but that could take an evening alone. She joined the State Department, was there for essentially a decade, primarily or entirely in the Office for Resources, Planning, and Policies in 3 different tours, interrupted first by the Council on Foreign Relations, in which you had a hand in developing an organization designed to study the problems of conflict and anticipate them and hopefully head them off and give advice if they did occur. And that now is a huge organization. Following the State Department, and I should note you also left for the Peace Corps for a while to be their deputy financial officer. The career after the State Department, which ended in 2001, which is not a coincidence apparently, but in any case led to a period of time in Paris and elsewhere consulting on issues of this kind having to do with the same problems that we're talking about tonight with think tanks and international organizations and some private organizations. And then a good long 7 years or so with the Refugee Committee, International Refugee Committee, where she was a vice president, largely to talk to our government and others giving support to that agency. And of course now is in a central position, and if you look at the things that organizations on which she serves as a board member, they're interested in international security questions, and especially in ways of providing that security through things like development and a greater use of diplomacy. The image that one gets from that career, which is an absolutely interesting career, I think, though, is one that has really touched all the bases. And she's written an article on ways to forestall terrorist financing. And she's written and talked extensively about development, so that in the course of that career, I think she's touched base with all the people, or most of the people who are expert in the matter. She knows the subject well. This should be an absolutely marvelous evening. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce the Assistant Secretary of State, Ann Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Frank Bird, especially for your gracious remarks. And I could have sat here and listened to you talk about how wonderful I am all evening. I don't know why we have to start the program. I was enjoying myself. But thank you to you and your team for putting this together, and also for so many people turning out. I'm really pleased that so many people could make it this evening. And thanks to World Relief, who works with our Bureau is one of 9 groups that works with our organization to resettle refugees in the United States, and it's great to be in Baltimore. I was in Berlin yesterday with Secretary Kerry, and then I was at work this morning with Secretary Kerry, and I'm not quite certain, where I am, but I know Baltimore is a nice place. I've been here before. I like to come to Baltimore. You're all smiling at me, so I may not quite be awake fully, but I'm very, very pleased to see so many people to discuss this important topic of the fact that we have millions and millions of migrants and refugees, and to talk about what Americans can do to help. In recent weeks, the world has been riveted by the largest refugee crisis Europe has faced in generations. The tragic stories and images we've seen remind us these are families just like our own. They have toddlers who wear little sneakers. They have been torn out of their normal lives and subjected to horrors because of the accident of where they were born. Why is this happening, and what can be done? Europe's dilemma is one dimension of a global problem, is not a new problem. Roughly 60 million people have been driven from their homes around the world, more than at any time since World War II. So it's not a new problem, but the scale of the problem is what I think is really challenging us today. Americans can take heart that we are already a leader in helping refugees and delivering aid around the world. We also lead the world in resettling refugees in this country. Today I want to tell you about refugees, but also internally displaced persons and migrants, how they are similar and different, and what more we can do to help them. Why are there record numbers of people on the move? In the past 5 years, violence has erupted, smoldered, or flared anew, terrorizing and scattering civilians from Syria, Ukraine, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, the Central African Republic, Libya, Mali, northeastern Nigeria, and Burundi. Protracted crises continue in places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, Burma, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. Today's conflicts are not just numerous, they are often brutal, chronic, and intractable. Long-term, unceasing violence or oppression means that uprooted people aren't able to go home. 45% of refugees today are displaced for 5 years or more. A child born in a refugee camp at the start of a crisis will often spend his or her entire childhood away from home. In some situations, camp midwives, and this is true, camp midwives deliver the grandchildren of the original refugees. Refugees, who numbered 19.5 million last year, make up just one segment of this population on the move. The legal definition of a refugee is someone who has fled across international borders because they have a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. But most of the 60 million people displaced globally are not refugees. Approximately 38 million are internally displaced persons, or IDPs, who have not crossed international borders. For instance, when ISIL, or Daesh, seized roughly a third of Iraq, more than 3 million people fled to other parts of Iraq, especially the Kurdish areas in the northeast of the country. IDPs do not enjoy the same type of protection that refugees do under international treaties. The 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol do not apply to them. International organizations once refrained from helping IDPs for fear of violating member states' sovereignty. Turmoil, civil war, and atrocities in the 1990s in the Balkans, Haiti, Rwanda, and elsewhere prodded the United Nations to adopt IDP guidelines in 1998. African nations drafted and signed on to the more binding Kampala Convention a decade later. Still, responsibility for helping IDPs rests primarily with their own governments. And sometimes these governments are the problem. Syria is home to 7.6 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, or 1/5 of the world's total. The Assad regime drops barrel bombs on its own people, destroying hospitals and schools and killing rebels and civilians alike. In South Sudan, leaders have put their own feuds ahead of the welfare of their people, repeatedly pushing the country to the brink of famine, ensuring that one of the world's poorest countries remains that way. Despite the recently signed peace agreement, government and opposition forces continue to violate the ceasefire they agreed to honor. The Geneva Conventions state that non-combatants must be treated humanely. International humanitarian law prohibits directing attacks against civilians, including civilian humanitarian personnel, or aid workers, delivering assistance. But militias and governments alike flout these rules. Despite 2 UN Security Council resolutions authorizing the delivery of aid into Syria, humanitarian workers continue to be harassed, threatened, or even killed. In South Sudan, combatants have attacked food convoys, kidnapped and killed aid workers, and fired mortars and rocket-propelled grenades into UN compounds where terrified civilians seek refuge. So let's review. Refugees are people who have left their own country to save themselves from persecution or war. And internally displaced people, or IDPs, are those who flee the violence but try to survive within the boundaries of their own home country. So, who are the migrants? A migrant is anyone on the move from country to country. So it's a much bigger category. A migrant can be a hotly recruited technology expert with a visa for a job in California, or a poor person without papers willing to take any job. Like IDPs and refugees, migrants traveling without documents can be exceptionally vulnerable. Americans have been shocked by images of half-starved people from Bangladesh and Burma abandoned on boats by ruthless smugglers, and reports of boats sinking and capsizing in the Mediterranean, drowning hundreds of migrants at a time. Economic migrants suffer alongside refugees. Both are subject to the same threats. They can be abused, raped, kidnapped, or crammed into the same trucks, cages, and leaky rubber boats. In Malaysia and Indonesia, traumatized Bangladeshis told me about being starved and beaten by the crew on ships and seeing bodies dumped overboard. The International Organization for Migration has estimated that 10 to 15% of the world's migrants, or between 23 and 35 million people, are undocumented. Even if they reach their destinations, the undocumented remain vulnerable. People who falsify documents, overstay visas, or work in an underground economy often fear deportation if they go to the police or other authorities for help. Sovereign nations, of course, are not obligated to or capable of opening their borders to everyone seeking a better life. But migrants need to be carefully screened and protected if being sent home would put them at risk. So, what is the United States doing about these situations? The U.S. leads in contributing to humanitarian operations around the world. We do this chiefly by working with the top UN and other international organizations in the field. My bureau funds the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, and others. And then meanwhile, the U.S. Agency for International Development funds the World Food Program, the UN's Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and we also channel relief dollars through other UN agencies like UNICEF and through the best non-governmental organizations and charities that work in the field. These operations deliver essential life-saving assistance food, shelter, medical care, and clean water and sanitation. They do more than just aid because they're also supposed to protect. They protect the rights of the displaced, care for survivors of sexual violence, reunify families, educate children and youth, and help people gain the skills they need to be self-sufficient. We can do this year after year because of steadfast support from Congress. Even in an era when bipartisanship often seems dead, lawmakers continue to come together to generously fund humanitarian efforts. Lawmakers have also supported our refugee resettlement program, which identifies some of the world's most vulnerable refugees, brings them here, and offers them a fresh start. The United States resettles more refugees than all other countries combined. Most refugees get jobs, enroll their children in school, pay taxes, revitalize communities, and after 5 years, many choose to take the test to become naturalized U.S. citizens. They contribute immeasurably to the life of our nation. As you may have heard, next year we will accept at least 10,000 refugees from Syria. Some critics say that number is too low. Others oppose admitting Syrians, arguing that terrorists may seek to enter the United States as refugees. The U.S. government is taking every possible precaution, screening applicants with extensive security checks and lengthy in-person interviews. This process is deliberately thorough and careful and takes some time. The days of airlifting thousands of refugees and bringing them to Guam or Fort Dix, New Jersey, ended on September 11th, 2001. We are, however, determined to do more to help the world's refugees. This is why Secretary Kerry announced yesterday in Berlin that the United States would increase the numbers of refugees we bring to the United States each year from all around the world, from the current level of 70,000 to 85,000 in fiscal year 2016 and 100,000 in fiscal year 2017. And I believe the White House a little earlier today should have announced additional funding for assistance to people inside Syria, innocent civilians inside Syria and in the surrounding neighboring countries, to help them survive in their region so they don't have to make this difficult trip to Europe. U.S. humanitarian aid and diplomacy are vital. In crisis after crisis, we have been able to spearhead the international response and use our influence to help keep borders open and aid flowing. This has helped save millions of lives. But today, aid groups are stretched thin. The World Food Program has been forced to cut food rations for Syrian refugees in the Middle East. In fact, all of the UN humanitarian organizations are grappling with severely insufficient funds to address a long list of crises. The United Nations is seeking $19.5 billion for humanitarian assistance for 2015, and we're now 3/4 of the way through the fiscal year. It's received less than a third of that. The United States has pledged or contributed half of the funds raised to date. So you see my point, we're doing our share. Where are the other donors? How can we close this yawning gap and meet such vast needs? Private giving could help. In just 1 week after the photo of the drowned Syrian toddler hit social media, donations for the U.S. Fund for UNICEF jumped more than 600%. The charity Save the Children raised 4 times more in that week than it had over the previous 8 months. This is a big change from earlier patterns of giving, and the question for me is whether this level of engagement will last. In general, even people who give generously for disaster relief tend to shy away from man-made crises. After Haiti's devastating 2010 earthquake, donations poured in. It was reported that half of all American households contributed money. The U.S. aid agency World Vision raised $36 million from Americans in 2010 after the Haiti earthquake. Now, listen to this part. In the first week, they raised $6 million of that. So after the Haiti earthquake, their supporters all gave generously. I mean, that's a lot of people giving, $6 million. In contrast, in the first 4 years of the Syria crisis, World Vision raised only $2.7 million from the public for their response to the calamity. So $6 billion in 1 week for Haiti, $2.7 million over 4 long years for the Syria crisis. So I see, a key difference, and I think it's that man-made crises can be messy and complex. Image after image of bombings, barbed wire, and misery can be overwhelming, even numbing. But 7 million children have been affected by serious crises. Millions have suddenly found themselves impoverished. Young daughters are married off, and many children are unable to go to school and forced to work so their families have enough to eat. Children have witnessed war and terror and are traumatized. A whole generation urgently needs help and care, and that is why my colleagues and I support the No Lost Generation campaign launched by UN agencies and non-governmental organizations. So No Lost Generation, or also the hashtag Children of Syria, are the 2 hashtags to follow to join this conversation. To cope with the magnitude of crisis we are facing, we also need more nations to contribute what they can. Countries already shouldering enormous responsibilities need help. Because of Syria's war, Germany now leads the world in taking in asylum seekers or refugees who travel on their own to a new country and then petition to stay. Turkey now hosts more refugees than any other nation. They just recently surpassed Pakistan. And Lebanon has absorbed so many Syrians that every 4th person living there is now a refugee. But Lebanon, by the way, is the size of Connecticut. So you gotta think about what this is like for them. But other nations, too, are coping with large influxes of people in need. Uganda accepts refugees from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, Somalia, and Burundi, and allows them to work and farm to support themselves. Ethiopia hosts refugees from Eritrea in the north, Sudan and South Sudan to the west, and Somalia in the south. 2 years ago, I traveled to Burkina Faso and was amazed. The Burkinabe, which is the name the Burkina give themselves, had not only opened their borders to refugees from Mali, they had let them bring their cattle and other animals and shared their pasture lands too. So there's a first time for everything, and this was my first time meeting refugee animals. The same, which are very important, let me tell you, when that's your whole livelihood. The same handful of nations that always provides financial backing for aid operations is doing it now. In addition to the United States, these traditional donors include Western European governments, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and more recently, Korea. At critical junctures in the past few years, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, and Emiratis have given hundreds of millions of dollars to help cope with the emergencies in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. But donations from the Gulf countries have not always flowed through UN agencies and tend to come off as one-off, unique contributions. I would like to see these countries become regular annual donors and contribute through top-notch aid agencies. This can ensure funding is not wasted and is well allocated and coordinated. We also would like to see some of the world's other established and rising economic powers, like Brazil, Russia, India, and this week President Xi from China will be visiting Washington, so let's definitely include China, more engaged on humanitarian issues. We are also funding programs that are more efficient. For instance, the majority of the refugees actually don't live in camps. The majority of the refugees live in towns and cities. Instead of handouts, it might make more sense to hand them an ATM card, or better yet, a work permit. Instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, vulnerable groups such as women and children, the elderly, and the disabled need aid tailored for them. Relief and development experts need to collaborate to help countries like Lebanon, Jordan, or Chad, and Niger that have taken in huge numbers of refugees despite their fragile economies. Development agencies should build more classrooms, hospital wards, and water systems so that societies that are hosting refugees do not suffer for doing the right thing. The World Humanitarian Summit that UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has scheduled for spring of 2016 offers an opportunity to call attention to what does and doesn't work in humanitarian response and recruit more governments and organizations to invest in best practices. We can help governments respond humanely when migrants and refugees arrive at their borders. We can crack down on human smuggling and explore legal alternatives to dangerous, irregular migration. Legal migration can fill gaps in the labor pool, provide a financial lifeline to families and communities back home. Finally, and most importantly, we must stay vigilant and engaged and take whatever action we can to stop ethnic, religious, and political rivalries from exploding into violence. We must do what we can to prevent life from being so bleak that risking death seems preferable. We cannot magically inoculate the world against poverty and war, but we can build up resistance. This means strengthening programs run by the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development that foster the rule of law, fight corruption, and create economic opportunity overseas. The point is that whatever we do, however incremental, it matters. Whether they are visible under the glare of TV cameras arriving in Europe or in more remote corners of the earth, each person fleeing has a story. Often these are stories of incredible determination to survive, to protect their families, and to make something of their lives. They seek safety, but also seek the dignity all people deserve. Despite borders and barriers, despite our different circumstances, our fates are linked, and their fight should be not only theirs, but our own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was a nice overview, and paints I think, a comprehensive view for us to discuss. First question. The question is, why can't we have the massive resettlement that we did with Vietnamese refugees a few years ago?
So, of course, I'm sympathetic to that idea, but even the person who's even more sympathetic is my boss, John Kerry, who fought in the Vietnam War and felt a personal responsibility for the refugees that came out, and so remembers that era. And that really was the high point of bringing large numbers of refugees to the U.S., but we continued to do that intermittently in the intervening years because during the Balkans wars, also large numbers came. And we did bring Iraqis here before 9/11. So a lot of people are asking that question. And while I'm completely sympathetic, I just don't see it happening because of the concern that we would somehow permit a terrorist to sneak in as part of this group. We have a very careful, deliberate vetting process, security vetting process. We also run names. I mentioned in my talk the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, interviews every case, which is essentially an individual or a family trying to get to the U.S. And they're very good because sometimes these are people who have been terrorized by people in authority. So, they've been interrogated sometimes. So the people interviewing them have to be compassionate, but also have to be careful and have to be persistent and have to be patient. They do about 3 interviews per day. And I think one reason it takes a while for us to get refugees here is there are limits on the resources that DHS can put to that piece of the interview. But we also will need to up the resources we're giving the UN Refugee Agency, referring to people to us. So can we bring more? Yes. Can we bring hundreds of thousands quickly? Not using our current system. So now I'm being pushed by a lot of people in the administration, a lot of friends, to see if we can really reinvent this system in a way that would move things faster, but not cut corners on security. That's the question of the day, I think.
Comment upon the role of the Department of Defense.
So Department of Defense main mission is not delivering humanitarian relief, no matter what you see in a nice recruiting advertisement from one of the armed services that if you join them, you'll be rescuing people from tsunamis. But nobody has the ability to move faster across the world and respond quickly than our military. And so most of the time, the current international system can operate without DoD resources. DoD will never be your lowest cost provider of a response. It'll be the fastest and the furthest moving. I made that point, right? But it will not be your low-cost response. So what the appropriate involvement of DoD is, I think, is that when there's a natural disaster that requires a really fast response with some people who are very well organized, incredible communications capabilities, incredible agility to get places fast with a real powerful response, it's great to have DoD involved. In war zones, you don't want the U.S. military there unless there's a deliberate decision to involve them, and you don't want them necessarily on the humanitarian side because you may want a group like the International Committee of the Red Cross that has a history of going to places and having neutrality, not taking a side, just trying to seek to help innocent civilians, try to visit people who've been detained, try to reunify families, try to go back and forth across the battle lines, not choosing a side in that fight. And we support those organizations because they can play a neutral role in very, very dicey situations. And in that kind of a situation, sending in U.S. troops, even if they were to say that they were going to do a humanitarian role, could very quickly spiral into something very different. So I greatly admire DoD's capabilities, but we like to use them for very unique services and mostly in response to natural disasters, or right now with the Europeans to provide military assistance to militaries that are being asked to do things that are related to border security.
Would you comment on the track record of Arabs being resettled in Arab countries?
Of the 19 million refugees in the world, 5 million are Palestinian. And they live in 3 countries and then 2 other spots. They call them the 5 fields. So they live in Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza. So the ones that were in Syria, like the Iraqi refugees who had fled Iraq to live in Syria, are finding themselves in the middle of a war zone. So many of them, not all of them, but many of them are fleeing again, which is a terrible situation. Many of the Palestinians are going to Lebanon. Lebanon has a problem counting how many Syrians they're hosting. They know it's a lot, but they had Syrians living in their country already because Lebanon is a sort of business capital of the Middle East. And so a lot of Syrians, even if they were successful business people inside Syria, they would have a home in Beirut, or they would go back and forth, they would get to the coast. Officials from Jordan would be the first ones to remind me just what you reminded me, that they had taken in Palestinians, they had taken in Iraqis, and now they're taking in Syrians. So from their standpoint, this is the 3rd population that is coming into a very small, they will tell you, poor country. It's a middle-income country, according to the World Bank. But when you have all these people show up, suddenly your society is being stretched to do more and more. So in the surrounding neighbors of Syria, we can include Turkey in this. The first time I went to Turkey, I met refugees from Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan. Turkey hosts a lot of refugees. But they had never quite seen anything like the Syrians coming across their border. So what some have criticized is that the Gulf countries are not resettling refugees to the Gulf. We talked about the sort of uneven record of giving by Gulf countries, some very big donations, but then maybe the next year nothing. And in terms, what the Gulf has done is not resettled refugees or given them a permanent home, but they will claim they have a lot of Syrians living there, in part in countries like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, because they'll give them work permits to people with talent to come and bring their families, and they're permitted to stay temporarily and work, which is a way to find a sanctuary and a safe haven in the midst of war. But it's certainly not as generous as what the United States refugee program offers. So there is some controversy on the record of the Gulf countries. And so when you're asking about resettlement or taking in refugees,
Successful resettlement.
Yeah.
Not temporary.
So you would get the Jordanians saying, well, we thought the Palestinians were temporary. They're still here. And, now we're very nervous about the Iraqis and Syrians. And, so this is very much a live issue in that region. I think a lot of Syrians are very shocked that their country has exploded like this. I visited Damascus in 2008, in part to thank the Syrian government, and I can't believe I'm saying this, for having taken in so many Iraqi refugees. And they were a society, looking around. I had never heard that much about Syria as an American. I had never expected to visit Damascus. Damascus was beautiful. It was a tourist destination for Europeans. It had incredible archaeological museums and history, history that place names that I knew from the Bible were in, there on the ground in Damascus, So I just thought, wow, I got to take a second look at this country. But before I could make a second visit back and ever get to Aleppo, the whole place has been destroyed. So I think that a lot of the issues underpinning your question about how well can people move around the Middle East, who can host whom, are these things permanent or temporary? These are the types of questions that the citizens of the Middle East are asking themselves and each other. And they're very, very worried, that this is unsustainable.
Is there a kind of a plan for where in the United States refugees would be settled?
Yeah, can I get your address, please? What street are you on? No, it's an excellent question, and it's a question I get a lot, especially traveling around the U.S., because people think, well, we have people with needs in our own country. Why are we bringing additional people with needs? And one, simplistic sounding but really important reason is that it's a great American tradition. And I think that it is a lot about who we are. Many of us are descended from immigrants and refugees. And so this is something that actually adds to the vitality and the diversity of our country. So that part, I think, is very smart. And then the other piece, though, is that this program works. Year in and year out, it works. Now, we have to be careful. We have to send people to places where there are jobs. It doesn't make sense to bring in refugees and set them up for failure if we send them to places where there are no jobs. And in 2008, during the economic downturn, it became harder for refugees to find jobs all over the United States. And what happened was they did find jobs, it just took them longer. And that had to be taken into account in the program. The program is pretty tough on refugees. These are people who've been traumatized often. They get to the United States, if they're able-bodied, they have to find a job within 3 months and support themselves and their families. And that's a lot to ask of people who may or may not speak English, or have been through a lot in the past, don't really necessarily know our culture. It really depends. Some people come and they're quite educated, like Iraq sent many people who'd been translators, they were professionals, they'd been doctors, their big issue was they weren't allowed to practice. They didn't have a license to practice these professions in the U.S., and so they had to adapt. But sometimes we bring people who don't speak English or who live their whole lives in camps, who don't know all about the modern conveniences in a kitchen. And so for those folks, what they often have to do is take a job at the very bottom of the social ladder. And we find that they do get jobs in agriculture, in chicken processing plants. A lot of refugees become housekeepers or bellboys in hotels, or work behind the scenes where English language is not that necessary. And they are incredibly grateful to our country. They are highly motivated, hardworking people. Their kids get enrolled in school, and the kids, of course, this surprises no one in this room, are, instantly bilingual, very quickly adjusting. That's the least problematic, is to bring little kids. But that older generation that has seen so much of terrible things happening and is starting over, a lot of them still have it tough in our country, but they have the world's best attitudes. They feel that the future of their families are at stake. So what we insist on is that the organizations we work, and like I say, we work with 9 different groups across the U.S. They're 6 faith-based, 3 non-sectarian. There are 300, there's over 180 towns and cities involved in this program. And then there are some 300 or so places within those towns and cities, when you add them all together, where there's different groups doing this. And so it's not a program, we do spend federal government dollars on this, but it's not a lavish program. I mean, we provide assistance to the groups that are resettling them, but then they often rely on volunteers and donations, furniture for that first apartment, or pots and pans, or a used computer for if there's a high school kid in the family. And the amazing thing is, it works. The program works. I worked for Madeleine Albright, and she was a refugee from what was then Czechoslovakia. And, she was the little kid who, acclimated, and her mother never quite spoke English perfectly. And her dad was a professional, so he taught. He was a professor. So I find that people like her feel a little uncomfortable sometimes being called a refugee, because they feel that somehow they're making a claim that they were impoverished. But even if you come from nice circumstances and you manage to recover your life here, it's still incredibly challenging. So I think we can do it. I know we can do it. We can take in as many as we're bringing in. I think we can bring more, and I think we can be smart about it and send them to places where they'll be welcomed and they will do well. We do resettle refugees in Baltimore. The big states that take them right now are Texas is number 1, and then California and Illinois, I think, are the other 2.
What leverage do we have or use to get other countries which are wealthy to provide more help to the refugees? And the questioner was specifically the Arab states. Certainly
the Gulf Arab countries are very concerned about what's happening in and around Syria. Because like I say, Syria was a stable country, a stable dictatorship not too long ago. And so they do not want to import these problems, and they see how close they are. And Yemen also has grabbed their attention. They're very concerned about it. So what we have, I guess, is their own sense of self-interest as a starting point. And then we have the fact that we have our senior leaders in talking to them about a whole range of issues on a regular basis. I mean, the world really is becoming smaller in that sense, that my boss can, fly in and meet with people on a pretty regular basis. So I think we build on those things, the fact that we have more opportunities for conversations and building relationships, and that they themselves are very concerned about the situation. Now, what we don't have is sort of a long experience of common approaches to resolve crises by working together and taking similar responses. That's where I think we have a lot of work to do.
Would you comment upon two things, the migratory pressures from Latin America and then the conditions which may encourage that?
The questioner is absolutely right in describing a situation happening in the northern triangle of Central America, the countries of, let's make sure I got that right then, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, thank you, where there is a great deal of narcotics related problems and also lawlessness. And the criminality has reached a peak. I admire I don't know if you all get this, but WAMU in Washington has done a series on this that is really good reporting. The criminality is driving people away from their homes and to make another dangerous journey, which is to walk up through Mexico or take the train through Mexico and come to the U.S.-Mexican border. And what was particularly shocking for many of us was last summer, a year ago summer, all these unaccompanied children showed up because their parents had told them, it's too dangerous for you here, you should try to make it in the United States. And some of them even had a parent in the United States already working. Maybe they'd been living with the grandparents or the other parents, they were separated families. So many children showed up, and then some were children with a single parent trying to join the parent in the U.S. I take your point that it's not in my speech, and it should be. I think we edited it out at one point because it's a very important situation. So thank you for the question. What we have tried to do is the same thing we're trying to do in the Middle East, which is to try to get aid into the source countries to stop the problems. The thing is, this is not something you can solve overnight. It's a really complicated, dangerous situation. So, and we saw how, there was so many resources mobilized to the border last year to try to stop people from coming across. Now, the numbers dipped this summer, in part because the Mexican government was stopping more people. But one of my criteria are that you should treat people humanely. So we don't know how Mexico may be treating people coming across their southern border, but that has partially been responsible for stopping the flow. There's certainly a lot of communication back and forth between U.S. authorities and Mexican authorities trying to figure this out. But it has not been solved because, I heard in the news the other day, El Salvador is still very, very dangerous place. One of the things we have with the European crisis is that the Europeans feel like they are in the lead on coming up with a solution. We look to them to come up with a solution. It's their continent. In this case of the Central Americans, it's really the United States that has to take the lead on trying to organize a conversation about what to do and to work with these countries. A nice thing is that there used to be more of a sort of north-south disagreements over migration. And we have done a lot in this administration to work with Mexico and not to be antagonistic on these issues. And I think that this is helping. I found that last year at this time, I was in meetings with the 3 foreign ministers from those Northern Triangle countries. And there was a good rapport back and forth trying to figure out what to do. But the problem in these countries is really severe. I agree with you 100% that it is deserving of our attention, our aid, and our humanitarian instincts to do more for these people. We set up a program since last summer to allow that if the parent were legally present in the United States, lawfully present in the United States, they could petition to have their child come and join them. So several thousand people have applied to do this, and They have to have a DNA match. It's a brand new program. And not that many have been found to be legitimate refugees so far, which was surprising. So, and not that many have arrived so far. So this is obviously only a partial solution, because first off, a lot of these kids didn't have a parent who was lawfully present here. So they are a big piece of this, I think. And then secondly, why are they being found not to be bona fide refugees? That's up to the asylum system in the U.S., the domestic system that I don't work on, but that's a mystery a bit. That's a bit of a question, I think, that we have to look at. If you're fleeing criminality, you know, are you going to be determined not to be a real refugee? And DHS has the ability to parole them into the United States, and I think they'll do that. But like I say, it's only a piece of the solution.
Your story could be told year after year after year, and I know because I've traveled the world and I've seen these people. The lucky ones live on dirt huts. Their species running down the rivers is incredible. But so much of it is a failure of administration policy. Not just this current administration, but previous administrations as well. You said that ISIS has control of 1/3 of Iraq. They wouldn't if we left a contingent force in Iraq. The problem in Latin America, one of the biggest problems, is our appetite for illegal drugs.
I think the camera picked that up. The question essentially is, how would you change administration policy to overcome the difficulties mentioned?
Well, as I travel around the world, of course, you can tell from the way I talk about our country that I'm very proud of our country, and I think we can be a force for good. And I guess other people that listen to me from other countries would say I'm in fact boastful about what the U.S. is doing right. They would not hesitate to remind me about the things the U.S. has done in our history to contribute to, war and conflict and problems around the world. So, I think if you total it all up, we're more a force for good than we are the problem. But I get that all the time. I once briefed these rising Chinese officials. They were all like between 35 and 40. And the one question I got, I just didn't see coming, was, why are you creating all these refugees by starting these wars and then helping them? And that's not how I would have described what we do, but that's how other countries sometimes see us. And so we are definitely scrutinized, every single one of our actions internationally. And that's one reason we want to speak up and be very clear on our priorities in the humanitarian area, because when we do, we have influence.
The question is, can you convince the American public that whatever risks are involved in dealing with the refugee situation are really unquestionably a security advantage?
So one of the things I say is that even though I think the chances of a refugee applicant and really being a jihadi trying to get into the U.S. are quite slim, that we take it seriously in the State Department. And so we want to have like a proportionate, smart response. And I have to remind people sometimes, foreign service officers are the targets of terrorists. They have died in the embassy bombings. We don't mess around with security for ourselves, so we don't even mess around for the security for our friends and relatives here in the United States. So I think we have to have a very good security vetting procedures, but not overdo it and not throw out the whole program in the off chance that maybe someone will apply. We've got to I've got to convince you all that we can screen those people out, that we can really do a very thorough job in catching the bad actors and focusing on the people, the vulnerable people in need. So when you're bringing little kids, obviously, they'll be influenced the most by our society, but also other people who clearly pose no threat to the U.S. And then another piece of your question, I think, is how much the U.S. benefits when we bring in people from all around the world. And so I talked about that little speech about the vitality of our country then, and the diversity actually makes us stronger, and that people then, Utica, New York apparently was almost a ghost town and has now been completely revived by all these refugees from around the world who've come in. So, there are these advantages, but even look at situations like when we send our troops overseas. If we have in those platoons people who are second generation and speak the language, the local language, we are so much smarter, When the intelligence agencies can hire people, or the State Department can hire diplomats who have familiarity with these, different cultures around the world. Even if it's responding to the Haiti earthquake, to have Haitian Americans involved really makes our response so much stronger. So I think I really think this is, I've said it before, I really think this is something that works for America, that is part of who we are, and that can be very successful.
I think you also implied whether generosity increases an image in such a way that we're less vulnerable. If you wanted to comment on that variable.
I think that in the past, like when I lived in Germany in the 80s, they had this saying that they weren't an immigration land, unlike the U.S., Canada, Australia. And over time, they gave up saying that, actually, because they realized they were in the center of Europe. People were coming and going. They had an aging population, that they could use some fresh blood. And so it hasn't been an easy road, but they really have become much more international in their focus about who makes up the German people. So I impress the heck out of my staff because I can say we are not an immigration land in German. Wir sind kein Einwanderungsland. But they don't say that anymore, so.
I have to apologize to so many people. There are a lot of questions left. We have to, unfortunately, end the period. We agree to curtail this at 10 minutes after 7. I think it's been marvelously informative. Thank you so much.
I think this is a marvelous audience. Thank you so much. Thank you, Baltimore.